The record was never meant for your eyes. 4 leather-bound journals, ink fading but still legible, hidden in a hospital archive under layers of bureaucratic dust. The words inside are not a case study. They are a confession. A man of science clawing at his sanity, begging anyone who found his notes to understand what he himself could not. They describe a child, a girl who never raised her voice, who never once lost her temper, whose small hands clutched a book of poetry as if it were the only relic of her vanished parents. A girl who smiled politely as one by one the people around her descended into madness. Her name was Mary Whitmore. And here is the secret you were never supposed to hear. In the winter of 1874, 5 people tied to her, servants, teachers, family, fell apart in ways medicine could not explain. Perfectly sound minds disintegrated, memories crumbled like burned paper, and the most rational men of Boston's intellectual elite began whispering of something far darker than disease, something that used a child as its mask. This is not a ghost story. Ghost stories end at the edge of imagination. What Dr. Alistair Finch documented was something worse: influence without contact, psychological infection, a force that left no trace in the body but devoured the mind. He did not call it possession. He did not call it madness. He called it the Cartwright case. And in his last, desperate entry before he vanished from Boston society entirely, Finch wrote a single warning line: "The child is not a child. She is an instrument." Now, before we pull this thread and descend into the forbidden corridors of Mary Whitmore's story, I need to know something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city, your state, or even the smallest town in the comments right now. I want to see how far this circle of knowledge spreads, how many of you are stepping into the shadows with me tonight. Because understand, once you hear this story, you cannot unhear it. Once you follow me down this path, the way you see innocence, empathy, even the structure of your own mind, will change forever. Boston in the 1870s was a city divided. Gaslit salons of intellectual brilliance rising above alleys still haunted by the Civil War's dead. It was here, in Beacon Hill's most polished homes, that science and wealth tried to build a fortress of order against the chaos of the world. But order is fragile, and when the Cartwrights, wealthy, childless, philanthropic, opened their door to a 9-year-old orphan named Mary, they believed they were healing a wound. They believed they were saving her. They had no idea that by welcoming her into their perfect home, they had invited the undoing of everything they trusted about reality itself. Mary Whitmore did not scream. She did not threaten. She did not curse or lash out. What she did was worse. She watched. She listened. She asked questions with the precision of a surgeon. And as the weeks passed, the walls of that perfect house began to rot, not from termites or time, but from the inside of people's minds. First a housekeeper, then a governess, then a butler, then a child, all unraveling while Mary sat quietly, eyes calm, as if she were taking notes for a study no one else had consented to. So why am I telling you this? Because history buried it. Because the official files were sanitized, archived, and forgotten. But Finch's private journals survived, and they are too disturbing to ignore. Tonight, we will reopen them together, and when you hear the details, you will realize the most chilling truth of all. The monster in this story never raised a hand. She didn't have to. This is the descent into the mind of Mary Whitmore, the girl doctors could not explain, and once you step forward, there is no way back. The Cartwright family believed they had been blessed. Henry Cartwright, a man who measured the world in ledgers and shipping routes, saw Mary as proof that fate could balance his fortunes with legacy. His wife, Eleanor, fragile in her longing for a child she could never bear, saw the girl as an answered prayer. They welcomed Mary into their Beacon Hill mansion as though she were a symbol of renewal, of love born from loss. They told themselves she was an orphan rescued, but what they had truly invited inside was a question without an answer. Mary arrived with nothing but a thin, tattered book of poetry clutched in her hand. It was not the book that unnerved the household staff. It was the way she treated it. The slim volume was opened often, but never read aloud. Her eyes would scan the pages with the composure of a scholar, not a child. She did not giggle or stumble over words as others her age might. She lingered silently on verses of grief, of shadow, of forgotten things, her lips moving soundlessly as if rehearsing some private liturgy no one else was meant to hear. At first her silence was mistaken for humility. She obeyed commands without protest, answered questions only when asked, and seemed to dissolve into the background of every gathering. But this was not shyness. This was observation. The servants began to notice her presence in doorways, watching from corners, eyes fixed not on the events of the house, but on the people themselves, their gestures, their tones, the quiver of their voices when they spoke in confidence. She catalogued, she assessed, and though she rarely interrupted when she did speak, her words carried the weight of precision. The first to falter was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman who had served the Cartwrights for decades. Her composure was legendary. She ran the household with military discipline, and nothing escaped her attention. But within weeks of Mary's arrival, Mrs. Gable began to change. Her hands trembled while sorting linens. She misplaced items she had kept in perfect order for years. She confessed to other servants that she felt watched, not in the natural way of a child's gaze, but as if her very thoughts were being measured. She began to hear whispers in empty corridors, faint and indistinguishable, that ceased the moment she turned. Whenever she confronted the source of her unease, Mary was there, standing at the end of the hall, head tilted, smiling faintly as though she had been waiting. The girl would not speak. She would not approach. She would only watch until Mrs. Gable turned away in dread. The dogs were next. The Cartwrights, 2 Irish setters, loyal companions for years, shrank from the child. They growled low when she entered a room, their bodies tense, fur raised as though a predator had crossed their path. Eleanor scolded them for cruelty, but Henry excused it as adjustment to a new presence. Only Dr. Finch, the family physician, paid close attention. He had seen animals react this way before, but never to a child who had done nothing at all. Dr. Finch was summoned more frequently as the house fell under a subtle shadow. Mrs. Gable's decline accelerated. She became irritable, confused, often claiming objects were moved when no one had touched them. Her memory fractured, her voice trembled, until one evening she fled the kitchen in terror, insisting that Mary had been standing silently beside her for hours, though others swore the girl had been upstairs the entire time. Within weeks, Mrs. Gable was dismissed, her mind unraveling to the point of incoherence. And as she was led away, it was Mary herself who expressed the most perfect imitation of sorrow. She clung to Eleanor's dress, eyes wide, lips trembling, her voice laced with childish grief. "I think something is wrong with Mrs. Gable. She keeps crying. She says things that don't make sense." The Cartwrights praised Mary for her sensitivity, blind to the calculated detachment in her gaze, as the only woman who had suspected her was carried out into the night. Dr. Finch, however, was not blind. He had treated countless children in his career, but never had he felt the weight of a stare so precise, so cold. He wrote in his private file, a separate, hidden record he dared not place among official hospital documents, that Mary Whitmore regarded people not as companions, but as specimens. His pen scrawled a question that chilled even him. Is it possible for one human being to poison another's mind, without words, without action, by presence alone? The question would not leave him, and Mary was only just beginning. If Mrs. Gable's collapse had been dismissed as fatigue, the next unraveling could not be explained away so easily. It came with speed, precision, and a cruelty that seemed designed. Mary's next subject was not a servant with decades of service, but a woman of education, intellect, and composure. The governess, Miss Agatha Croft. Agatha was a Cambridge-educated scholar, sharp-minded and full of vitality. She had been hired to oversee Mary's lessons, and at first she delighted in her new pupil. Mary's intelligence was startling. She absorbed material with unnatural speed, recalling entire passages after a single reading, solving arithmetic with unnerving ease. Yet what most impressed and eventually unsettled Miss Croft was not Mary's intellect, but her stillness. During lessons, the girl would fix her gaze on the governess with such intensity that Agatha began to feel stripped bare. Mary did not blink often. She did not fidget. She watched as though waiting for a crack in the mask, a misstep, some weakness to exploit. At first, Agatha attributed her unease to nerves. After all, many children stared at their teachers. But Mary's stare was not that of a student eager to learn. It was the study of a predator. Within weeks, Agatha's nights were tormented. She confessed in letters to her sister that she could not sleep. Her dreams were vivid, grotesque, visions of drowning, of walls closing in, of voices repeating her thoughts in whispers until she could no longer tell if they were her own. She awoke drenched in sweat, pacing her room until dawn. Her diaries, once neatly ordered, became frantic scrawls of paranoia, servants plotting against her, books rearranged, pages missing from her private notes. She wrote that she felt her thoughts were being siphoned, stolen before they even reached her lips. She turned to Dr. Finch in desperation. He remembered her words precisely. "She is not learning from me, doctor. She is studying me, and she is finding what she is looking for." Finch prescribed tonics, rest, rational explanations, yet even he could not deny the deterioration. Within 2 months, Agatha Croft was unrecognizable. Her once steady hands shook uncontrollably. Her eyes darted as though pursued by something unseen, and then came the night when she broke entirely. Servants found her sobbing uncontrollably, unable to remember her own name, pleading to be freed from a prison no one else could see. The Cartwrights sent her quietly to a private sanatorium in the countryside. Her career was destroyed, her mind fractured beyond recovery. And again, Mary was the one who brought the crisis to light. With perfect timing, she approached Eleanor, clutching at her skirts, voice trembling with the exact pitch of childish fear. "I think something is wrong with Miss Croft. She cries and says things that don't make sense." Eleanor praised the girl for her perceptiveness, for her compassion. She never noticed that when Agatha was led away, Mary's eyes did not glisten with tears. They gleamed with something colder, almost clinical, as if she was satisfied to see the conclusion of a study she had begun weeks before. Dr. Finch did notice. He recorded the governess's words in his hidden journal. He began to suspect that what he was witnessing was not coincidence, nor the fragile constitution of sensitive minds, but the deliberate work of a force far darker. He recalled the stare, the unblinking gaze, the perfect mimicry of sorrow and compassion without a shred of feeling beneath it. He wrote, "She wears innocence as a mask. Her study is not knowledge, it is dissection." But suspicion was not proof, and before he could gather evidence, the next subject began to fall. This time it was not a young governess or an aging housekeeper. It was the butler, a man of unshakable loyalty, whose collapse would drag the household deeper into unease and force Finch to confront a terrifying possibility that Mary's reach was not limited to the weak or fragile. Her reach was systematic, calculated, and widening. The collapse of a servant might be explained away as exhaustion or dismissed as unfortunate chance, but when the butler, Mr. Alistair Jennings, began to break, the air in the Cartwright household shifted from unease to dread. Jennings had served the family for more than 3 decades. He was discipline incarnate, a man whose mind was as orderly as the ledgers he maintained, and whose health was as solid as the brass fixtures he polished. He was the anchor of the household, the quiet constant in a world that changed around him. And yet, under Mary's gaze, even Jennings began to unravel. It began subtly. A headache here, a moment of disorientation there. He complained of sharp migraines that came suddenly, like knives driven through his skull. His memory, once flawless, began to betray him. He forgot dinner schedules. He misplaced correspondence. Once, in front of guests, he addressed Henry Cartwright, not by his name, but by his dead father's, a mistake so grave it left him shaken for days. Jennings confided privately to Dr. Finch. He admitted that the episodes were always worse after spending time with Mary. The girl had taken a peculiar interest in him, following him through his duties, asking him endless questions, not the usual childish questions of play, but detailed interrogations about his past. She pressed him for memories of his wife, who had died 10 years before, her eyes, her voice, the final words they spoke before her death. She asked him to repeat these details over and over until he grew weary, until he felt as though he were living inside the moment again, trapped in grief he had barely survived the first time. "She wants to know everything," he whispered to Finch. "Not in a kind way, not as a child curious about the world, but as if she's recording me, pulling pieces from me and storing them somewhere. I cannot see. It feels invasive. like she is crawling through my memories and choosing which to touch, which to twist. Then came the night he was found collapsed in the pantry, clutching his head, eyes wild, unable to form coherent words. Mary was the one who discovered him. Calmly, she informed Eleanor of his condition, describing his symptoms with a precision that froze Finch where he stood. She noted the dilation of his pupils, the pallor of his skin, the cadence of his broken speech. Her words were not those of a frightened child. They were the detached observations of a physician taking notes on a patient's decline. Finch examined Jennings but found no physical cause. No tumor, no stroke, nothing that could explain why a mind so disciplined had frayed to ribbons. Jennings was forced into early retirement, sent to live with his sister in the countryside. His years of service ended not with honor, but with disorientation and shame. On his final day, Mary handed him a drawing she had made, a small, careful sketch of a ship on the ocean. "So you won't forget Mr. Cartwright's business," she said sweetly, her eyes wide with apparent innocence. The gesture was praised as thoughtful, but Finch noticed something the others did not. The ship was not any vessel. It was a perfect replica of the Eleanor, the ship Henry Cartwright's younger brother had captained years earlier, the ship that had sunk, taking his life. Jennings had once shared this memory with Mary in confidence, and now she had placed it before him, etched in ink, a reminder of a tragedy he had never wished to revisit. The household was shaken. Within months, 2 pillars of stability were gone. Yet the Cartwrights remained blind. They told themselves that fate had struck twice, nothing more. If anything, their affection for Mary deepened. She was a comfort, they said, a light in their time of sorrow. But Finch knew better. He could feel the noose tightening, and when the Cartwrights' young nephew began to wither under Mary's gaze, Finch understood that what he had witnessed so far was only the prelude. The real experiment was about to begin. Edward Cartwright was 12 years old, the nephew of Henry and Eleanor, and unlike the servants or governess, he was not bound to the family by duty but by blood. He was a boy of energy and laughter, the kind of child who filled a room with mischief, whose footsteps always seemed too quick for the staircases of Beacon Hill. He adored the Cartwright home, often spending weekends with his aunt and uncle, running through its polished halls and tormenting the servants with harmless pranks. To Edward, Mary was simply another curiosity. At first, he teased her. He tugged her ribbons, he mocked her silence. But Mary never reacted the way children usually did. She did not pout, she did not shout, she did not cry. She only watched him, her head tilted, eyes storm-dark, lips curved faintly in something not quite a smile. Edward expected anger, but what he received was attention. Mary began to follow him quietly, unobtrusively, until her presence became unavoidable. When he sat to play, she was there. When he read, she sat beside him. She listened to him more than anyone else ever had, her face a mask of calm as he rattled off his childish boasts, his secrets, his dreams. Slowly, Edward changed. His mischief dulled. His laughter became rare. He began to brood, sitting alone in corners where once he had played. His nights grew restless. He screamed himself awake, whispering of a shadowed man who stood in the corner of his room, watching, waiting. His appetite failed. His eyes sank into hollows. Eleanor thought it was illness. Henry thought it was a passing melancholy. But Finch recognized something else, the same progressive erosion he had already seen in the others. He began making discreet visits, watching carefully how Mary interacted with the boy. At first it seemed innocent, Mary reading to Edward, Mary playing chess with him, Mary quietly keeping him company. But Finch began to notice the way Edward's face changed when she spoke. The boy's jaw would tighten, his eyes would dart, his hands would clench unconsciously in his lap. Mary's voice was soft, melodic, but there was something in her tone that unsettled even Finch when he lingered outside the door to listen. One afternoon, Finch overheard what he would never forget. Mary was not reading to Edward, nor was she playing. She was describing in chilling detail the process of being buried alive. Her voice was calm, deliberate, clinical, painting each stage with the precision of a lecturer. The darkness, the weight of the soil, the slow suffocation, the heartbeat pounding in the silence until the sound itself became unbearable. Edward sat rigid, pale, his eyes wide, as Mary spoke without fear, without hesitation. Finch burst into the room, unable to contain himself. He found the boy trembling, his lips parted in horror, while Mary looked up with wide, innocent eyes. "I was only trying to help," she said softly. "Edward is afraid of the dark. I wanted to make him braver." The audacity of the lie stunned Finch. The explanation was not merely false. It inverted the truth with surgical precision, forcing the listener to question his own sanity. Was she truly helping? Could such cruelty be reframed as compassion in the voice of a child? The room itself seemed to bend beneath the weight of the inversion. Edward's decline accelerated. Night after night he woke screaming, begging for relief from the man in the corner. His once lively spirit crumbled into silence. His mother, frantic, sought answers from every physician she could find. None Puritan vidded an explanation. None could pierce the fog of his mind. But Finch knew. He knew because he had heard the words himself. He knew because he saw the same calculated gleam in Mary's eyes that he had seen when Agatha Croft was carried away, when Jennings collapsed in the pantry, when Mrs. Gable descended into confusion. Mary was not simply a witness to suffering. She was its architect. And as Edward slipped further into the nightmare she built around him, Finch realized that the child's experiment had moved beyond servants and teachers. She was turning her gaze onto blood, onto family. And the final collapse, he feared, would not be confined to Edward. It would consume the Cartwrights themselves. Dr. Alistair Finch could no longer tell himself these were coincidences. A housekeeper shattered, a governess broken, a butler discarded, and now a boy unraveling before his eyes. The pattern was too deliberate, the progression too methodical. If it had been disease, it would have spread randomly. But this was different. It was selective, chosen, and always centered on one quiet child with storm-colored eyes. He began to look backward, searching for roots. Where had Mary come from? What soil had produced her? What trauma could shape a child into such a merciless observer? The Cartwrights had said she was an orphan from St. Jude's foundling home, left parentless by a cholera outbreak. But orphans leave traces. Finch wanted those traces. He went to St. Jude's under the guise of charity, presenting himself as a physician interested in the welfare of children. The matrons welcomed him, proud of their institution, and gladly provided what little record they had of Mary Whitmore. Sparse pages. An admission ledger noting her arrival at 6 years old. Parents' names crossed out. No certainty of their identities, only whispers of a family erased by plague. No photographs. No letters. She had arrived with nothing but the same worn book of poetry she still carried, clutched to her chest like an icon. Finch questioned the staff. They spoke of Mary with reverence, even admiration. She had been their model child, obedient, respectful, never troublesome. But as they spoke, the same phrases repeated. Quiet presence, unnerving calm, strange effect on the other children. He pressed for details. Slowly, reluctantly, they gave them. One matron recalled how fights had broken out among the other orphans, petty quarrels that escalated into violence, always in the beds nearest Mary's. She herself never struck a blow, never raised her voice, but arguments bloomed where she lingered, like mows, LD in damp wood. Another told of a cruel boy, older, who tormented the younger children. After a series of hushed conversations with Mary, he developed a crippling fear of birds. The mere sight of a feather sent him into convulsions. He left the home soon after. And then there was the girl, Mary's only true companion. One morning, without warning, she ceased to speak. She did not utter a word again for the remainder of her years at St. Jude's. The staff had no explanation. Physicians called it trauma, but no one could name the source. In every story, Mary was present, always in the periphery, always calm, always untouched by the chaos she seemed to conjure in others. Finch recorded these testimonies with growing dread. There was no beating, no neglect, no clear injury to explain her nature. She had not been shaped by violence. She had been born into it, or perhaps born as it. He wrote in his journal, "She is not a victim who mirrors pain outward. She is a void who draws pain inward and then reflects it back magnified. The others are her instruments. But the most disturbing discovery came not from the matrons, but from the files of the parish priest who had occasionally visited St. Jude's. In one yellowing sermon draft scrawled in the margins, he had written a single note about Mary Whitmore. Her questions unsettle me. A child should not speak of souls as if they were machines. When Finch read those words, he felt the echo of his own private thoughts. He remembered her asking him in her deceptively calm tone, "At what point does a memory become more real than the present? Can someone be made to live inside a nightmare even while awake?" This was not trauma speaking. This was inquiry, a researcher's question. As Finch walked away from St. Jude's, the gaslight of Boston's streets seemed dimmer, the air heavier. He knew what awaited him back at Beacon Hill was not coincidence, not contagion, not even evil in the way priests spoke of it. What he had uncovered was something more dangerous, a method, and Mary Whitmore was perfecting it. Armed with what he had uncovered at St. Jude's, Dr. Finch returned to the Cartwright household with a new resolve. He could no longer remain a passive observer, cataloguing tragedies as though they were medical curiosities. He had to test her, probe her, confirm what he now suspected, that Mary Whitmore was not merely a child with unfortunate influence, but an active agent of something far darker. He began cautiously, observation first. During dinners he watched her hands. Most children fidgeted, tapped forks, spilled drinks. Mary's movements were precise, deliberate, almost ceremonial. She cut food into even pieces, ate slowly and always, watched others more than she partook herself. Her stillness at the table was uncanny, as though she were feeding on something beyond the food. Next, Finch tested her with questions. He spoke casually, as if making conversation, asking about her day, her lessons, her games. Most children replied with chatter, tangents, bursts of uncontained energy. Mary's answers were measured, stripped of flourish, yet laced with a peculiar sophistication. She never asked why, only how the steam engine worked, how long a man could live without food, how much blood the body contained before life ceased. Always how, never why. As if meaning itself were irrelevant and only mechanics mattered. Finch escalated his experiments. He introduced subtle lies into conversation to test her perception. Once he told her that Edward had been seen playing happily in the garden earlier that day. Mary's eyes flickered just slightly, and she corrected him at once. No, he didn't leave his room. Finch's chest tightened. She was right. He had invented the detail, and her certainty was not the smug correction of a clever child. It was the unflinching precision of someone who had already calculated the truth and marked his lie the instant it left his lips. Another evening, Finch tested her compassion. He dropped a glass deliberately near her feet, shattering it, and feigned pain, clutching his hand as though cut. Eleanor rushed to his side, Edward startled in concern. Mary did not move. She only watched, eyes locked on the bloodless wound, lips parted slightly as if in silent thought. When Eleanor scolded her for not offering aid, Mary blinked slowly and said, "He wasn't truly hurt. He only wanted to see how I would react." The words froze Finch. She had inverted the experiment. She had caught him in his test. Worse, she had unmasked it with clinical clarity, stripping away the mask he thought he wore so well. From that night onward, he began to suspect that his probing was no longer hidden. She knew. Perhaps she had always known, and now she was studying him in return. Finch's notes became frantic, his handwriting jagged with urgency. She anticipates deception. She detects falsehood instinctively. She is not passive, she is diagnostic. Each question I pose, she answers, not to satisfy me, but to gauge me. I fear I am no longer the examiner, but the examined. One night, as he passed her chamber, he overheard her humming softly. Not a child's lullaby, but a low, rhythmic melody, almost mathematical in its cadence. He leaned closer. The words, if they were words, were whispered beneath her breath, fragments of phrases about doors, about shadows, about voices in the walls. He strained to listen, and then, abruptly, the humming stopped. Her voice cut through the silence, clear and cold. "Doctor, you shouldn't be outside my door." Finch recoiled. She had not seen him. She had not heard his steps, yet she knew. That night he wrote his most chilling entry yet. The mask of innocence is not slipping. It was never real. She is aware, entirely aware, and I have crossed from witness into subject. The experiment is now mine. And with Edward still withering, the governess gone mad, and Jennings lost, Finch began to see the trajectory of Mary's work. The next collapse, he feared, would not be random. It would be chosen, and the target most likely would be Eleanor Cartwright herself. Eleanor Cartwright had always been the most steadfast defender of Mary. While servants collapsed, while Edward withered, while Finch's doubts sharpened into conviction, Eleanor's faith in the girl only deepened. She saw in Mary not a predator, but a child robbed of parents, craving affection. The more Finch whispered caution, the more Eleanor clung to her maternal devotion. Mary seemed to sense this bond and to seize it. She began to attach herself to Eleanor with new intensity. She shadowed her every movement, slipping into her sitting room uninvited, standing silently beside her as she sewed, waiting just at her shoulder as she read. Eleanor laughed at the girl's persistence, calling it endearing. Finch watched it with dread. The transformation began subtly. Eleanor, who had once filled the house with music, singing at the piano, humming in the corridors, fell silent. Her cheer dimmed. She became withdrawn, her laughter muted, her expressions dulled. She spoke less to her husband, less to her friends, and more only to Mary, and always in whispers, as though confiding secrets too delicate for the rest of the world. Finch noted the change in his journal. Mary does not demand attention by tantrum. She cultivates it by absence, by starving her subject of all other ties until only she remains as sustenance. Eleanor has ceased to live outwardly. She lives now only in reflection of the child. Then came the dreams. Eleanor began waking in the night, gasping, clutching at Finch when he was summoned to her chamber. She described visions of her late mother, standing in corners, silent, watching, her face half-shrouded in shadow. At first Finch wondered if grief had simply surfaced, stirred by the weight of stress. But then Eleanor said something that turned his blood cold. "She tells me the same things Mary does." Finch pressed her for detail. Eleanor hesitated, ashamed. Then she admitted, "Mary speaks to me of loneliness, of how no one truly knows us, of how our own families are strangers who only pretend to love. At night my mother whispers the same, as though the words are not mine, not Mary's, not even hers, but something passing between them, into me." From that point forward, Eleanor became more fragile. She flinched at sudden noises. She wept without clear reason. She paced the halls in the dead of night, wringing her hands, murmuring fragments of Mary's own phrases, questions about memory, about dreams, about the thin line between thought and reality. One evening, Finch discovered Eleanor seated in the nursery with Mary. The child was brushing Eleanor's hair, slow, methodical strokes, speaking softly. Finch could not hear the words, only the cadence, the hypnotic rhythm of her tone. Eleanor's shoulders sagged as though under a trance, her eyes glazed, her lips parted faintly in something between exhaustion and surrender. When Finch entered, Mary stopped mid-stroke and turned her gaze on him. Her eyes gleamed with something that almost resembled irritation, as if his intrusion had interrupted an experiment mid-measurement. Eleanor blinked awake, smiling faintly, and murmured, "She takes such good care of me." Finch nearly cried out, "Care?" The woman was dissolving before his eyes, and yet she thanked the child as though Mary were her balm, not her poison. That night, Eleanor confided to Finch with trembling hands, "I feel as though she understands me more than Henry ever has, more than anyone ever has." The words sealed Finch's certainty. Mary was not dismantling Eleanor with cruelty or fear, as she had the servants. This was subtler, more elegant. She was unspooling Eleanor's mind with intimacy, weaponizing affection itself. Henry Cartwright had built his life on foundations of reason, a man of numbers, of ledgers, of ships that crossed oceans with mathematical precision. He did not yield to superstition, rumor, or emotional indulgence. Where his wife saw art and feeling, he saw balance sheets, contracts, the steady beat of commerce. And for years that discipline had served him well. But now, in the winter of 1875, cracks began to spider through the steel of his convictions. It began with Eleanor's decline. At first, Henry dismissed her nervous fits as exhaustion. The long winters weighed on everyone, he told himself. She only needed rest, perhaps a season in warmer climates. But her deterioration refused to be explained away. The woman who once moved through their parlours with regal assurance now seemed perpetually on the verge of tears, her eyes hollow, her voice trembling with some private fear. Worse, she clung to the child. Henry would wake at night to find Eleanor not beside him, but seated in the nursery, Mary curled against her like a confidant, whispering into her ear. Eleanor would look up at him with the faint smile of a mother soothed by her daughter's presence, and Henry, though relieved to see his wife comforted, felt an unfamiliar unease coil in his gut. It was not natural, he thought, for a child to be the sole anchor of a grown woman's sanity. The second fracture came through his nephew Edward. Once lively and mischievous, the boy had become a ghost of himself. His sudden fits, his silent hours, his haunted eyes, all of it gnawed at Henry's certainty. He had told Finch to search for a cause. The doctor found nothing but shadows, yet Henry could not shake the image of Mary's still gaze fixed upon Edward whenever the boy's hands shook or his voice broke. As though she were watching his unravelling with a patient curiosity, not sorrow. Still, Henry resisted suspicion. He analysed, excused, denied. Until the night of the dinner. They had hosted a small gathering of Boston's intellectual circle. 2 professors from Harvard, a shipping partner from New York, and their wives. The evening began with lively conversation and good wine, yet midway through the meal, Henry noticed something uncanny. Every guest at the table, without realizing it, had turned their eyes toward Mary. She sat at Eleanor's side, quiet, proper, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. She spoke little, but when she did, the table fell silent. Her words, simple observations, questions about history, about philosophy, were delivered with such calm gravity that the learned men answered as though to a colleague, not a child. Henry watched as the rhythm of conversation shifted, as though the girl's presence had bent the room's gravity. Even the servants moved awkwardly, stumbling over trays, their eyes flicking nervously toward her. By the end of the night, silence pressed heavily against the house, a hush that seemed to linger even after the guests departed. Later, Henry confronted Eleanor. "She commands too much attention," he said quietly. "It isn't natural." Eleanor turned on him, her face pale, her voice sharp with an edge he had rarely heard. "You will not speak of her that way. She is ours, Henry. She is the only child we shall ever have." The words struck him like a blade, not because of her anger, but because of the fervor in her tone, fervor that bordered on fanaticism. Henry, the man of numbers and reason, realized with growing dread that his wife was no longer her own. She was under the child's shadow. That night, he found Finch waiting in his study. The doctor's expression was grim. "You feel it now, don't you?" he asked. Henry said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Finch leaned closer, his voice low. "Mary Whitmore is not merely peculiar. She is corrosive. She eats at the mind. Your household is collapsing around her." Henry wanted to deny it, to accuse Finch of exaggeration, but the weight of Eleanor's trembling hands, Edward's haunted stare, the silence at his dinner table, they all converged on one unbearable truth. The fortress of reason had finally been breached. Henry Cartwright now saw the crack, but the question was no longer whether Mary was a danger. It was how deep her reach had already burrowed into his house, and whether it was too late to expel her. The confrontation did not come in rage, nor even in suspicion. Henry Cartwright was not a man of rash impulses. He approached problems as he approached business, with calculation, with preparation, with quiet resolve. And so, when he resolved to speak with Mary directly, he did not announce it to his wife, nor to Dr. Finch. He chose his moment carefully, like a man preparing to test the hull of a ship against an uncharted reef. It was late evening. Eleanor had retired early, her nerves frayed, her body exhausted. The servants were dismissed. Mary sat alone in the drawing room, a small fire crackling in the hearth, her pale face haloed in orange light. She was reading from the worn book of poetry she had carried with her since the orphanage, her single possession. Henry entered quietly, closing the door behind him. "Mary," he said, his voice steady. The girl looked up, her storm-grey eyes meeting his. She did not smile, did not curtsy, did not perform the charming obedience that disarmed so many. Instead, she closed the book slowly, resting her hands upon it as though she had been waiting for this moment. Henry cleared his throat. "You've become very important in this house, to Eleanor, to Edward, even to the staff. But you are only a child. I worry perhaps too much weight is placed upon you, too much influence." Mary tilted her head slightly, the firelight catching her eyes so they shimmered like glass. "Do you believe influence belongs only to the old?" she asked softly. Her voice was calm, even, yet the question struck him with the force of a challenge. Henry frowned. "Influence must be earned, child, through wisdom, through proof of character." "And what is wisdom?" she asked, her gaze never faltering. "Is it years of experience repeating the same mistakes, or is it seeing people as they truly are, not as they pretend to be?" Henry stiffened. "You are clevered." "Ah, Mary, but cleverness is not wisdom. You are cared for here, loved, but love is not licensed to control others." Mary's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Control," she repeated, as if savoring the word. "I do not control, I observe, I listen, and people show me what they hide from you." The air thickened between them. Henry felt absurdly as though he were in negotiation, not with a child, but with an equal, a rival merchant across the table, calculating leverage and yield. Yet there was something more disconcerting. Her composure was unshakable. Children, when challenged, bristled, wept, or sought approval. Mary did none. She held his gaze with the poise of someone who had weighed him long before he had thought to weigh her. Henry's jaw tightened. "You unsettle this house. Eleanor is not herself. Edward is not himself. The staff collapses, and everywhere, always, you. If you know something of this, you will tell me." For the first time, Mary's expression shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Her eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in a kind of patient amusement. She leaned forward, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. "Mr. Cartwright," she said, her tone even, almost gentle, "when a mirror cracks, do you blame the reflection, or do you ask why the glass was weak to begin with?" Henry's heart thudded. The words were far too measured, too precise. He felt the hair rise on his arms. Mary rose, clutching her little book of poetry to her chest. She walked to the door, paused, and glanced back at him with a gaze that lingered just too long. "Perhaps you see me as the cause, but I am only the revelation." Then she slipped out, leaving Henry alone with the fire's dying glow and the weight of words that echoed like prophecy. For the first time in his life, Henry Cartwright felt he had entered a contest where his ledger, his reason, his discipline, all the tools that had built his fortune, were useless. He had confronted the girl, and it was he, not she, who left unsettled. Dr. Alistair Finch had reached his breaking point. For months he had filled his journals with observations, patterns of decline, whispered confessions, unexplainable fractures in otherwise stable minds. But the confrontation between Henry and Mary confirmed what he had long suspected. This was no accident of temperament, no child's cruelty misunderstood. It was systematic, purposeful, and if it was systematic, it could be studied. Finch was not a man prone to mysticism. He believed in cause and effect, in pathology and diagnosis. If Mary Whitmore was dismantling minds, there had to be a method to it, something repeatable, something that could be measured. And so, he resolved to become not merely a witness to her influence, but its experimenter. He began with subtle tests. During his visits to the Cartwright house, he contrived reasons to leave Mary alone with various members of the staff, a kitchen maid, a footman, even a visiting cousin. He would watch discreetly from behind doors, noting her posture, her silences, the rhythm of her gaze. In every case, the results were the same. The subject would grow visibly uneasy under her presence, stumbling over words, fidgeting, perspiring. The longer her eyes lingered, the more erratic their behavior became. Finch wrote in his hidden notebook, "It is not speech that is her weapon, it is stillness, an economy of motion so profound that others project into it, their own fears, their own guilts. She is not injecting madness, she is excavating it." But he needed more. He devised a harsher trial. He arranged, under pretense of examining Eleanor's condition, to keep Mary in his study at the Cartwright home for several hours at a time. He brought out books, puzzles, even medical diagrams, as though testing her intelligence. Yet what he was truly studying was her response to stress. He described to her, in clinical detail, cases of hysteria he had treated, patients who had clawed at their own skin, convinced insects were burrowing beneath it. He spoke of a man who could not sleep, certain that when he closed his eyes, the dead would rise to strangle him. Mary listened with rapt attention, her small face calm, her storm-grey eyes unblinking. When he finished, she simply asked, "And did you discover the exact words that unlocked those thoughts? Or did they find them on their own?" The question was so pointed, so precise, Finch nearly dropped his pen. This was not a child absorbing tales. This was an academic query. He pressed further, shifting tactics. He produced a set of ink blots he had been studying, Rorschach-like figures long before the name existed. He asked her what she saw. Mary tilted her head, studying them for long minutes. At last she answered, "They are doors. Each one opens to a place the person does not wish to see. The trick is to find the key that makes them walk through." Finch's hand trembled as he recorded her response. She was not guessing, she was articulating a method. From that moment, he ceased to see her as merely peculiar. He began to view her as a scientist herself, though one whose laboratory was the human mind and whose instruments were silence, suggestion, and gaze. Yet even as his fascination grew, so too did his dread, because experiments, once begun, demand conclusions, and Finch knew the next step would not be passive observation. He would need to provoke her, to corner her into revealing just how deliberate her influence truly was. But in doing so, he would cross an invisible threshold, no longer doctor, no longer guardian, but adversary. And adversaries of Mary Whitmore did not leave whole. Dr. Finch knew subtlety would no longer suffice. His notes had grown into a mountain of conjecture, but conjecture was not proof. To shatter Henry's denial, to break Eleanor's blind devotion, he would need to show them Mary's influence in real time, strip away her mask and force her hand in the open. The opportunity came on a bleak February evening. A storm pressed hard against the city, rattling shutters, throwing the Cartwright townhouse into a gloom broken only by the glow of lamps. Henry sat in the library with brandy, Eleanor embroidering by the fire, Mary nestled at her feet with her little book. Finch arrived under the pretense of a medical check on Eleanor's health, though in truth he had come to spring his trap. He began innocuously, chatting about Boston's epidemic of nervous maladies that year. He described cases, real enough though embellished, of otherwise stable men who had fallen into madness after encounters with strange children at orphanages. He watched Mary carefully as he spoke. Her face betrayed nothing, but her hand turned one page of her book too slowly, her eyes flicking toward him just for a moment. He had her attention. Then he escalated. He told a story of a young patient who had been broken down not by disease but by suggestion, by a whisper at the right time, a gaze held too long. He leaned forward as he spoke, directing the words not at Henry or Eleanor, but at Mary herself. The girl looked up then, her storm-grey eyes calm and steady. "Do you believe madness spreads like influenza, Doctor?" she asked. Finch seized the opening. "I believe it can spread faster, through influence, through minds that prey on minds. And I believe, Mary, that some children, knowingly or not, become such carriers." Henry frowned. "Finch," he began, but the doctor raised a hand, silencing him. Mary tilted her head, her voice soft, almost bemused. "Then, perhaps your patient was weaker than you thought. A house that crumbles from a single draught was never built to last." The words fell like a stone into the room. Eleanor flinched. Henry's eyes narrowed. Finch pressed harder. "Or perhaps the draft was engineered. Perhaps the one who whispered studied the cracks until she knew exactly where to press. Silence thickened. The storm groaned outside, rattling the windows. Mary did not look away. Her gaze locked on Finch, unblinking, her small hands folded neatly over her book. Eleanor, unnerved, snapped, "Enough, Doctor. She is a child." But Finch's eyes never left Mary. He had no interest in Eleanor's protests. He was waiting for something, anything, that would betray Mary's awareness of the accusation. And then it came. A smile, small, fleeting, so slight it might have been imagined, yet unmistakably real. It curled at the edge of her mouth before vanishing, replaced once more by that mask of cherubic innocence. Henry saw it. Finch knew he did, for Henry's hand gripped his glass so tightly it trembled. Eleanor, however, did not. She clung to denial, scolding Finch for frightening Mary, gathering the girl into her arms as if shielding her from cruelty. Finch closed his notebook with deliberate care. He had not won, but he had planted the seed. Henry had seen the crack in the mask, and Mary had revealed, if only for an instant, that she understood the game being played, and that she was not merely defending herself, but enjoying the contest. As he left that night, Finch wrote a single line in his private journal. "The child does not defend, she challenges. The house is no longer theirs, it is hers." It began almost imperceptibly. Dr. Finch, so meticulous in his routines, found his concentration slipping. His handwriting grew erratic in his journals. Lines of notes meandered into fragments, half-thoughts abandoned mid-sentence. At first he blamed fatigue, too many late nights, too much brandy, yet beneath the excuses, unease gnawed. Mary had shifted her attention. He felt it in her silences during visits, in the way her gaze lingered just long enough to unnerve, then slipped away as if nothing had passed between them. She never challenged him aloud, never provoked as she had in the library. Instead, she eroded his certainty through absence, through leaving words unsaid. One night Finch dreamed of her, not as a child, but as a presence. He woke drenched in sweat, convinced she had been seated by his bedside, watching. The next day he attempted to write down the dream, but his pen refused steadiness. The image of her grey eyes hovered behind every line. The doctor's rational mind recoiled. She cannot attack. She cannot reach me outside their house. Yet doubt seeped in. What if her weapon was not presence but memory? What if she planted thoughts that persisted like seeds germinating in the dark? By week's end, Finch found himself rehearsing conversations with her when alone, arguing against words she had never spoken. He realized with horror that she had turned him into his own experiment, the subject unraveling under invisible influence. And still, Mary smiled when next he entered the room. Henry Cartwright began to notice what Finch already feared. Mary had fixed her attention on the doctor. During her quiet hours in the drawing room, she would occasionally lift her eyes toward Finch with that inscrutable calm, then look away before he could hold her gaze. It was the smallest of gestures, yet Henry saw how it shook the man. Finch, once brisk and commanding, now faltered mid-sentence, forgot names, lost his place in his own arguments. Eleanor, meanwhile, had gone the opposite way. The more Finch pressed his veiled accusations, the more she clung to Mary, her devotion sharpening into something perilously close to worship. She dressed the girl in gowns finer than her own, fed her morsels from her plate, and whispered endearments with an intensity that embarrassed even the servants. To Eleanor, Mary was not simply a child. She was salvation, her sole tether to calm amid the storm. Henry found himself caught between these two currents, his wife consumed by the child and his doctor consumed by suspicion of her. And Mary? Mary remained still, poised, her silence feeding both fires at once. One evening, as Finch fumbled through a consultation, Henry saw it clearly. Mary was dismantling them without lifting a finger. Eleanor was enthralled, Finch was unraveling, and Henry himself, though resolved to resist, felt the faint but growing pressure of her gravity. It was not confrontation that marked her power, it was patience. She let them collapse inward of their own weight. Dr. Finch resolved that if he could not reach Mary, he would reach Eleanor. The woman was frail, trembling on the edge of collapse. Surely if he could break through her enthrallment, the spell would falter. He chose his moment carefully, an afternoon when Henry was away at the docks and Mary was upstairs, supposedly napping. Eleanor sat in the parlour sewing with unsteady hands. Finch lowered himself into the chair opposite her, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Cartwright, I must speak plainly. Your affection for Mary is not maternal, it is ensnarement. The girl is not what she seems." Eleanor froze, the needle trembling in her fingers. Her eyes flashed, not with fear, but with sudden fury. "How dare you?" she hissed, rising to her feet. "You call my love unnatural? You insult my child?" Finch pressed forward, desperate. "Listen to me. Your decline, your moods, your terrors, they began with her arrival. It is not care she gives you, but dependence. She feeds on your fragility." Eleanor's face contorted, her voice trembling with a fervor that bordered on mania. "You are jealous, Doctor, jealous of the bond you will never understand. Mary is purity itself, and you poison us with suspicion." Her outburst shook him more than he expected. Eleanor, usually meek in her nerves, now burned with zealotry. Finch saw in that moment the depth of the hold. This was no simple devotion, it was faith. And faith, he realized with dread, is not broken by reason. Henry Cartwright had listened silently when Finch recounted the disastrous exchange with Eleanor. The doctor's words were ragged, his hands unsteady, but the message was clear. Eleanor was lost to reason. Mary had not merely won her trust, she had claimed her devotion like a sovereign claims land. Henry did not rage, he did not argue. Instead, he retreated into silence as if weighing ledgers too complex for easy resolution. Yet beneath that calm, a decision hardened. If Finch could not pry the truth from Eleanor, then Henry himself would take the measure of the girl, alone, unseen. That night, while the house slept, he moved through the halls with deliberate care. He lingered outside the nursery door, listening. A faint murmur came from within. Eleanor's voice, low and tremulous, speaking words Henry could not catch. Then Mary's, soft, steady, a cadence that seemed less like a child's chatter than a litany. He dared to peer through the narrow crack in the door. What he saw fixed itself into his mind like a brand. Eleanor kneeling before the child, her head bowed, as Mary sat upright in her little bed, pale hands resting in her lap as though receiving prayer. Henry closed the door quietly and withdrew, his breath tight in his chest. Whatever Finch had suspected, whatever Henry had tried to deny, there was no longer room for doubt. Mary Whitmore was not merely disrupting his house. She was enthroning herself at its center. From that night forward, Henry Cartwright became a ghost in his own house. He moved like a shadow through corridors he had once ruled openly, studying the patterns of the girl who had unseated him. Servants saw less of him, attributing his absence to business, but in truth, his ledgers remained unopened. His wealth meant little if his home had become a temple to something unspeakable. He began to watch Mary with a dispassionate eye, as though she were not a child but a specimen. At breakfast, he noted how her silences dictated the rhythm of conversation, how Eleanor glanced at her for cues before speaking. In the evenings, he observed the staff, their laughter subdued, their shoulders tense when Mary entered a room. Even the dogs, once loyal to Henry alone, had retreated entirely, refusing to cross her path. Most telling were Mary's private walks through the library. She never touched the books of verse or novels of romance. Instead, she lingered over volumes of philosophy, anatomy, and histories of madness, works far beyond a child's comprehension. Yet she turned the pages with slow precision, as if hunting for something only she understood. Henry kept his silence, but in his journal, hidden beneath the false bottom of his desk, he wrote a single line again and again, each night the same refrain: "The child is not a child." The weight of proof was gathering, but proof meant nothing without action, and action against Mary, he knew, would demand a kind of courage few men possessed. Henry summoned Dr. Finch under the pretense of a late consultation. When the physician arrived, weary from his own torments, Henry locked the study doors and poured 2 tumblers of brandy. His face was drawn, but his eyes burned with a grim steadiness Finch had not seen in months. "I have seen her," Henry began without preamble. "Not as you described, not as rumor whispers. I saw Eleanor kneeling at her bedside as though at an altar. And the girl, our Mary, sat in judgment like a queen upon her throne. Finch did not flinch. He only nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the glass. "Then you understand." Henry leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "This ends. Whatever she is, whoever she serves, we cut it out before she consumes us all." The physician agreed, but the words carried no triumph. Finch spoke carefully, outlining the risks. Eleanor's devotion would make any move appear an act of cruelty. The servants, frightened but silent, would not support them openly. And Mary herself, so calm, so calculating, would anticipate resistance. Still, Henry pressed on. "We take her away, tonight if need be. There are places beyond this city where no child can bend minds, no matter how strange. But she cannot remain here." Finch's silence stretched long before he finally said, "If we move against her, we must expect resistance not from Eleanor alone, but from Mary herself. You are not dealing with a child, Henry. You are declaring war on a strategist." Henry's reply was cold and final. "Then let it be war." Their plan was crafted in whispers, each step cloaked in the kind of secrecy men reserve for treason. Finch would prepare a carriage under the guise of a medical errand. Henry would insist Mary accompany him for a routine examination. Once outside the house, she would be delivered to an asylum outside Worcester, far enough that Eleanor could not retrieve her, far enough that Mary's shadow might dissolve in distance. But plans are fragile things when measured against a mind like Mary's. On the morning of their intended flight, the household awoke to an eerie stillness. The servants moved in silence, eyes hollow, as though they had not slept. Eleanor sat in the parlour, her hands folded neatly, a smile too serene for the hour. And Mary was waiting at the table, pale hands resting on her worn book of poetry. "You should not be nervous, Dr. Finch," she said softly as he entered. "The carriage will be ready at noon, but you won't need it." Henry froze. The words struck like a blade, not for their content, but for their certainty. She had known. Finch forced composure, but Mary's eyes never left him. "Plans change," she continued, tilting her head like a patient teacher correcting a pupil. "But you forget, Doctor. You write everything down, even your doubts. Did you think I would not notice?" Henry's throat tightened. She had read him. She had read them both. The war had begun, and Mary had already chosen the battlefield. Night fell heavy over Beacon Hill, the mansion suffocating beneath its velvet silence. Henry and Finch made one final attempt, desperation carving steel into their resolve. Armed with nothing but conviction, they crept toward the nursery, determined to seize the child before her web tightened beyond escape. But when the door swung open, the sight within stopped them cold. Eleanor sat beside Mary's bed, her head bowed in quiet devotion, lips moving in silent prayer. Mary looked up from her pillow, not startled, not afraid, only expectant, as though she had been waiting. "You came too late," she whispered. The words were not loud, but they pressed against the walls, against their chests, with the weight of inevitability. "You wanted to take me away, but I am already here, in her, in all of you." Eleanor rose, placing herself between the men and the girl. Her eyes, once bright with reason, were now glassy, suffused with the same stormy stillness that lived in Mary. Henry felt the ground tilt beneath him, the awful recognition that his wife was no longer his. Finch staggered back, clutching at his temples. A piercing hum, inaudible to others, split through his skull. He collapsed against the doorframe, gasping, eyes wide with the terror of a mind unraveling. Henry did not move. He could not. Mary's gaze held him as a hawk pins a rabbit, calm and merciless. And in that silence, Henry understood. She was not the girl doctors could not explain. She was the question no answer could contain. The Cartwright house would never recover. Boston would never know. And history would bury her name.